Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and today the question I want to answer is how would you use CSS files? Not just like linking a external CSS file or linking like a framework like Bootstrap or something, but how could you use your own local CSS file with Express using like templating engines or whatever. And this all comes down to the idea of static file serving. So what a static file server is when a web server just literally delivers files. So you have a folder with a bunch of files, and then it looks at the URL, looks at the file name, and just says, hey, do I have a file by that name? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a folder called static. Sometimes you'll see it called public. It can be either way. Okay, I'll do public because that's probably more typical. And this is generally referred to as a static folder. So we're going to set up our Express server to statically serve that particular folder. So basically, for any time it sees like a URL that matches a certain pattern, it's going to say, hey, let me go look in this folder to see if there's a file that matches that name. Okay. So we go to our server.js. I'm going to create a little middleware section. Okay, and then what I can do is to register a new piece of middleware, we use the app.use function. It just generally means do this. And built into Express is a middleware called static. So express.static. Now this function takes one argument, which is a string that tells it which folder is the static folder. So I wanted to know that the public folder is the static folder. Okay, so basically it's going to, that tells it there. Now by default, if I don't, the app.use can take two arguments. So by default, if I don't specify the first argument, which I didn't, it's going to assume that this is just based off the root URL, so slash. Okay, but what if I only want like to use a static serving when the URL is prefixed with like the word static or public or something like that? Any middleware can get any of these app.uses, any of these middleware can get a first argument, which is sort of like only use this middleware if the URL is this. So I'm going to say slash static. So that means only use this middleware if the URL starts with slash static, if the endpoint starts with slash static. Okay. Simple enough, right? Okay, so just to show you how this works, now if I go back to this public folder, and we'll call, actually I'll do slash public. Okay, just since the match the folder name doesn't matter. Okay, but if I create a new file, index.html, and I'll just make it say h1 cheese. Okay, what's going to happen is that now when I go to, actually let me just close all this and run the server, npm run dev. Okay, so the server is running, so let me head over to the browser. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to head over to localhost 3000 because that's where I have the server running. Now if I go to localhost 3000, I get this cannot get slash. That just means like, hey, I never made a route to get slash, which makes sense. I don't have a route for just plain old slash. Okay, the root route. I just have this static middleware. But again, that's looking for URLs that start with slash public. So if I do slash public, and then I get this that HTML file. Because generally, whenever you refer to a folder through a URL, the default behavior is to look for an index.html in that folder. So since I did slash public, and then slash public URLs always get passed to this express.static middleware, it's going to look inside that folder for an index.html. Now, what if I had an HTML file with a different name? So let's say I create another HTML file called cheese.html. And this said like h1 Gouda. Okay, well then you have to put the actual file name. So it would be like slash public slash cheese.html. Cool. So you can do that. You can actually serve your entire website. If you just want to do plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you weren't planning on doing any kind of back-end magic, you could just set up a static web server using Express with that one line of code, and now you can just put all your website in that public folder. That's an option. You can do that. But then in that case, really, why don't you just use Netlify or Vercel or GitHub Pages to deploy your website, or render.com, where you just don't have to build a server because you're just statically serving files. Okay. really what's oftentimes you're going to use this for is more the host like other types of files, like your CSS files. So if I were to create like a styles new file, I'll just create a CSS file, styles.css. Okay, and in here I'm going to have like a style that says like h1 color red. Okay, so now if I go to /public/styles.css, see, I'm accessing that CSS file. So now I can, I can use that URL, and I only have to really use this URL, like here, the actual endpoint, to then now like connect files to my CSS. Okay, and I now have a URL for my CSS file. So how would I use this with like a templating library? So there's plenty of templating libraries. Okay, so if you want to learn about like different ones, you can head over to my blog, toots.alexmercedcoder.com, and you can look up Express in the search bar, hit search, and then you can see here Express templating cheat sheet. This shows you like different things like Liquid.js and EJS and Mustache and Pug, handlebars, and just kind of shows you like their basic syntax and how to connect them to Express. Okay, I'm going to keep this real simple. Okay, because EJS is going to be the easiest one to use in the sense that like there's no setup. You literally, all you have to do to use EJS is just install it. npm install EJS. So I just shut off my server by hitting Control-C, then did npm install EJS, and I'm good to go. Okay, cool. So now let's do a route. I'm going to say app.get, make a get request. We'll just make it for like the main page. App.get / since we don't have a route for that. And then we do our normal like rec res. Okay, and then what we're going to do is say, okay, I want to res, meaning a response, and the response I'm going to use the render function. The render function uses a templating engine to not just deliver an HTML file, but to actually create an HTML file. So I'm going to have it like a template, my EJS file, which is like is only half the story, and I'm going to give it a bunch of data, and then it's going to mush those two together. So I'm going to say, hey, I'm looking for a file called index.ejs. It doesn't matter what the net file, as long as it ends in .ejs, we're good. So the reason I don't have to configure anything is just that by default, the way Express works is that it looks at the file extension. If the file extension is the same name as the library, then it's going to know what to use. So if it was like handlebars, you'd be like index.handlebars, mustache, index.mustache. That doesn't perfectly work with depending on the library you work, because if the library names don't match, then there's extra setup. But that's why I created the cheat sheet, to make that easier if you want to use other templating engines. Okay, but that's just the file. And by default, the res.render function looks in a folder called views. So we need to create a folder called views. These are all things you can configure in Express, but the defaults generally work pretty well. So it's like, why would you want to change that behavior? Okay, so you make a views folder, and then we can pass it some data if we wanted to. So we can say like name Alex Merced. Okay, cool. So then what would happen is that in my views folder, I would create a new file, index.ejs. And in that file, I could be like h1. And then I can actually use the variables that I pass in. So anything that was in that object. So if I go back to my server.js, see this object that I put in as a second argument? Any variables in there I can now use in this EJS file. So I can say, hey, and again, I would refer to the cheat sheet that I just pointed out for like more details on the syntax. It's not the point of this video. Name website. Okay, so now if I turn the server back on, npm run dev, and I go back to / here, hit enter there. See, it goes to basically, notice it says Alex Merced's website. It doesn't show all this fancy like syntax. Because what's happening is, again, whenever we run this, it's going to go to this file in the views folder, whatever file I specify here, and grab that string and say, okay, EJS, take the text from that file and then fill in like Mad Libs little spots that are specified with this data. Okay? And then you can actually run like full-on JavaScript logic in there. It's pretty cool. If statements, for loops right there in your HTML, which is kind of neat. Cool. So that's basically what EJS is doing. So now if I want to use that CSS file, well, that generally always happens inside the head tag. So I'll add a head tag. Okay, and notice I'm not writing like a body and HTML tag. Generally, if you forget to add an HTML or a body tag, it's going to assume that. So it's going to assume anything that's not inside a head tag is part of the body tag, and it's going to assume that everything has to be wrapped up by an HTML tag. So sometimes you can lean into some of the browser's default behaviors to save yourself some typing. Not that it's best practice is to always be explicit and set up the whole thing. Cool. But here in the head tag, what I can do is I can write a link tag and say link relationship equals style sheet, because it's a style sheet. Okay, and the href, like where I need to point it to, is /public/styles.css. So notice I'm not using a dot here because I'm not referring to where the file is relative to this file. I'm actually pointing it to a URL relative to whatever the domain is. So what it does, it takes whatever domain name you're currently on and slaps this on the end. Okay, in this case, localhost 3000, it slaps this at the very end of it. And that's generally the way that'll assume. Okay, so now if I do that and I go refresh the page, the CSS style sheet should now take hold. So this should turn red. So I hit refresh. I hit Control I, make sure it's getting the new version. Yep, I don't see the new version. What did I do here? Node server.js. Let me see here. /public/styles, yes. But I don't see that in there, so I have a feeling that this doesn't refresh. So notice I don't see the updated EJS code in here, or the updated HTML. I don't see the head tag in there. So that tells me that I need to do a hard refresh. So I'm going to hold Shift and then click refresh. And I still don't get it. So that is interesting. So let's see here. Oh, because I put this in the wrong file. So you notice I'm not editing my EJS file, I'm editing my HTML file from earlier. So let me copy that, put that in the EJS file. Okay. And now let me refresh. And there you go. You see that the style sheet took hold. And it works in that cheese site too. So again, I don't have to, it's not just for my templating, it's just literally for any HTML file. I can now refer to that CSS file by that URL. Same thing with like front-end JavaScript files. So again, if I go to /public/cheese.html, see it's red now. Okay. So now I can also do the same thing with like, again, a JavaScript file. So if I were to go here and say new file, app.js, and go back to my index.ejs here and say, hey, I want to put in a script tag where, you know, the source equals /public/app.js, and the add the defer keyword. Okay, that's going to make this file show up. So now I can do this. I can add like an alert and say it's connected. And now if I go back over here and refresh the page and see like little pop-up alert, it's connected. Okay, so that's generally like if you need to add front-end stuff like CSS files and front-end JavaScript. And again, that's a delineation. Like the server.js file, that's a back-end JavaScript because who's running that file? Node. I do node server.js. And any files that get imported into that file, anything that's run by Node is back-end code. Now the front-end code is going to be this app.js because how is that running? Based on a script tag in an HTML file. That means that code doesn't get run until this HTML opens up in the user's browser. Okay, so you always want to make sure you kind of keep clear sort of like which code is back-end, which code is front-end. Okay, because where it runs, like what code is running on the server versus which code is running on the client. But yeah, now I can add front-end JavaScript and CSS through these two files here, all thanks to our public folder. So that's how you would do that. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.